I have kept track of the books that I read this past year, and I do that for a couple of reasons. I like to see the metrics. I'm interested in how many books, and some years I measure how many pages. I'm interested in the volume of books, the volume of volumes. But I'm also interested now. I can look back and I can see in a single scan what's occupied my thinking through the year, because I do try to be intentional in what I read, in the sense that I read what I'm interested in. So I might go through a phase uh, where I'm really digging into something. For example, I read all of Kurt Vonnegut's novels over Thanksgiving. It's a big chunk. But there's also ideas that recur throughout, like every fifth book maybe is a topic, in this case on Stoicism. I've become very interested in Stoicism as an adjunct to my meditation practice. Uh, but there are other patterns that I'm not necessarily aware of at the time as I'm reading through, and I can see that when I look back here. So I'm going to go through this list. There are 51 books, so I'm really going to zip through. In previous years, so I now have this journal which I've kind of commissioned for keeping track of things like this, and for writing down quotes and poems and whatnot, so I have a single reference for that. These are pages from previous journals where I've torn out the pages. So I read 52 books this year. Last year I read 69. And I read that many because I was off work for 10 weeks, recovering from some surgery. And once my head got back together, I tore through pretty much everything that I reread a lot of stuff. I reread everything Ian Marchant has written. I read a bunch of Martin Amis, a bunch of Hitchens. That was 2023. 2022, I read 48 books, but I was tracking separately the dialogues, Plato's dialogues, and I read 14 of those in 2022. I don't know that I ever read all of them. I read a few more after that, but I didn't read all of them. In 2021, which was the first year that I kept track, I read 36 books. And several of those were book recordings. I do keep track of I do count certainly an audible book. But this year, interestingly, I had very few audible. In fact, I don't see any. Most of what I listened to when I listened to recording was from the Waking Up app that I use, Sam Harris's meditation app, which I use it daily, and for the guided meditations, but the conversations and discussions that are published on Waking Up occupy a lot of my time as well. I also was listening to a lot of French podcasts, so as I was walking the dogs, instead of listening to book recordings, I would be listening to French tutorials. So see, that's an interesting recognition there. I hadn't thought of it that way. In these previous years, I listened to a lot of Stoicism. My introduction to modern Stoicism was through Ryan Holiday's Audible books. So, in last year when I did this, I actually had the stack of books in front of me, and I picked them up one by one. That seems harder to do this year, partly because my workspace is quite chaotic, but it also just seems a bit much. So, in the first week of January, 1/7/24, I finished Portrait of the Artist by James Joyce. I was coming off. In 2023, I read a lot of Joyce. I read Ulysses again. I read the Richard Ellman biography. And so I read Portrait at the start of this year. Then I read the Penelopiad. It's by Margaret Atwood, and is a telling of the Odyssey from the perspective of Penelope. And that only took it took a couple of days to read. I finished it on the 8th. And I see throughout here the Odyssey and the Iliad show up in a couple of different places. So it was a theme through the year for me. It was sort of a learning and an immersion in Greek myth in general, but the Iliad, the Odyssey in particular. Hitchin Time by Christopher Hitchens. By him really is a collection of essays published posthumously. I love Christopher Hitchens, and I often read Hitch 22. I've probably read half a dozen times. That's his autobiography that he wrote it before he was ill. Finished that on the 15th. The 23rd of January, finished Jimi Hendrix Live in Lviv by Andrei Karkov. I read this with my daughter. She also read at the same time. And we had both read the Death and the Penguin and Penguin Lost, 2 books by Karkov. And were kind of really taken by them. Sort of quasi-magical realism set in modern day. The Penguin books are set in modern day Ukraine. I think Andrei Karkov has written or writes for The Guardian as with a literary perspective, a human perspective on the war. 129, I finished Tolkien and the Oxford English Dictionary, which was interesting but a little bit dry in my recollection of it. 130, I finished This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is maybe the only piece of fiction I've got on here. I don't read a lot of fiction, and I start each year. I've done the same this year. My goal to intersperse some fiction, and I want to make it easy. I think I'm going to go back and reread sort of the fantasy series that I used to really love. And we have a ton of them in our library, but they're all from like the 90s. I mean, it's 30 years ago. So I'm going to read some of those and just kind of enjoy it. February the 10th, Homer, the Odyssey. This was translated by Emily Wilson. This was a shift for the year because it's such a fantastic translation. I have the Robert Fagles translations of both, which I've read a couple times each, and really found enchanting. You know, the Iliad can be a bit of a slog with, 15 noble deaths recounted in each stanza. But that Robert Fagles translation kind of really does encapsulate an entire life. I very much felt like the context. The Odyssey, Emily Wilson translated, so it's quite a remarkable feat. It's written in very accessible English, and it's written in iambic pentameter. So it has, for me, for us as like sort of contemporary Western readers, the impact of it is the same as the Homeric epics would have been in Greece, where the language was contemporary and the inflections were easily recognizable, right? There was nothing, it wasn't modernist, it wasn't like reading T.S. Eliot, right? Maybe that's a good example. Now, this year, Emily Wilson finished and published the translation of the Iliad, which I now have a copy of, and it's soon. It's soon to come on my list of things to read. Every Good Boy Does Fine by Jeremy Denk. Oh, this was Audible. I listened to this on Audible. He read it. It's a wonderful biography. Jeremy Denk is a fantastic. Sorry, I keep moving this around. Fantastic pianist, a really interesting musician, and how he arrived at the point where he's at now. He's a good writer as well, and he's a very engaging reader. I listened to a couple of masterclasses he gave after I read this, and some of the things he said in those masterclasses really stuck with me. One of the things he said to a student who had played a piece was, there comes a point when you're working on a piece where you realize there's a listener involved now. And I know exactly what that means. Like, there's a point where I'm not so much thinking about, I'm listening and responding, still making mistakes, still not doing, but there's a listener that's been activated. And the way he said it just rang true, and is one of those phrases that has come with me from the year and is going to stay with me. Music and the Historical Imagination by Leo Treidler. Oh my God, this was a tough read. We read a lot of Leo Treidler when I was a grad student, which was in the 90s. And it's just jargony, and it makes sense if you're a grad student and if you're another musicological researcher. But it's not written for people who just want to kind of think about music. I didn't like it. I thought I would be inspired to put some of my own thoughts down. I was thinking of teaching a class for the at Penzic, and I thought this could be a good source, but my God, it was boring. Sorry, Dr. Lewis, Mary Lewis, who taught Treidler to our graduate seminar and did make it interesting, but God, it was dull to read. Now we're in March 10th, Stephen Fry, Mythos. Stephen Fry retells the Greek legends, the Greek myths, then the Homeric series. There's 3 books, the Heroes, Mythos. Mythos comes first, then Heroes, and then Troy. And honestly, I've read all 3 and feel like I got a better education in the classics than I would have if I'd been in university. Okay, then it took me a month, April 10th, 2024, The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. This was a book that I bought after hearing an interview with David Deutsch and Sam Harris and being really captivated. But it was a tough read. It was interesting, but God, it was hard to follow his thoughts on infinity, and probably maybe would justify rereading. But it took a month and it was a slog. May 4th. Yeah, in fact, it was such a slog I didn't read another book for a few weeks. Heroes by Stephen Fry. That's mine. I read Troy a few years ago. I don't think I read it again this year. April 12th, I finished Lessons from an American Stoic by Mark Matusik. This is a book about Emerson. This is where the year starts to pick up the Stoic element. This was a really good book. And my familiarity with Emerson comes entirely from high school, where we read excerpts of his essays as exercises in senior English. I don't think I read any Emerson in college. I was much more focused on British, James Joyce, William Butler Yeats, Auden. And this got me thinking about Emerson and reading some of his essays, which aren't reflected in here, but I have been kind of reading through some Emerson. And the Stoic thread comes through in all of this. Mark Matusek now has a series on the Waking Up app about journaling. It's good. 51724 From Strength to Strength by Albert Brooks. This I think I picked up after hearing Albert Brooks and Ryan Holiday talking in an interview on the podcast. I can't remember anything about it, except that I enjoyed it. I think it was, I don't know, can't remember. How to feel good about what you're doing? I don't know. 52524 Disciples Path. That this is a kind of a week-by-week survey of Methodism. So I finished it on the 24th, but I've been working through it for 10 weeks. It was one a week, 10 chapters on different aspects of what it is to be a Methodist. May 28th, Greek Myths by Charlotte Higgins. This was also an important book. Some of her retellings of the myths were, well, there's one. So before the Greeks sailed to Troy, they're becalmed, right? They've angered, I think it's Athena. So there's no wind. And so Agamemnon is instructed to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia. And the way that Charlotte Higgins tells this story, I wept when I read it. It's hard to read. It's hard to weep when you're reading a book because you're reading. But I was like, gee, oh God. And I want to put it to some music. It totally puts into perspective. So the whole of the Orestes and the Furies, where Orestes kills his mother, who's Agamemnon's wife, who murdered Agamemnon when he returned home. And the way that, certainly the way I felt about that was, wow, what a thoughtless thing to do, to kill your husband. Yeah, he's a jerk, but don't ever forget that he had sacrificed your child. It's fucking awful. 7124, a continuation of it. There were two books. There was a guide, sort of like a 10-week survey, and then there was like an in-depth chapter. I finished that after I did that second. Also in the beginning of July, Bernstein, biography by Humphrey Burton. Bernstein was a figure for me this year. I watched Maestro a year ago, and slowly, in retrospect, I can see that seeing that movie is what really made me realize that there was a gap in my life, that I hadn't ever conducted an orchestra. I've written, I play, whatever, comfortably advanced amateur level. I want to be able to conduct at that level as well. And I realized that there were a handful, 2 or 3 moments I can really pinpoint in my career or my education where I wasn't ready for an opportunity that was right in front of me. And if I'd been ready, I might have had a different engagement as a conductor in my life. I don't want to say that I would have had a different life, because I don't want a different life. But my life could have included some conducting. And I really wanted to do that. I really want that. So I started taking the graduate program. And reading that book, Bernstein, I also became much more aware of the music of that time. The Airborne Symphony. And the name of that composer is actually eluding me right now. That's terrible. I should have prepared that. But not just Copland and Bernstein, but um, an entire generation of musicians who were certainly well regarded and established at the time, but I've never paid much attention to them. But I am now, partly as because a lot of that repertoire fits with the ensembles that are part of the graduate program, uh, but also because I love that music. It fits in with how I love the slightly earlier French music, Poulenc and Ravel. This French music and this American later generation kind of meld very pleasingly in my aesthetic. Also, early July, I finished Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. I didn't write down who wrote that book, but it was a really congenial retelling of the hundreds of millions of years of dinosaurs, and then the really abrupt ending. Interesting. July was busy. I caught up a little bit. The Pursuit of Happiness by Jeffrey Rosen. This is a Stoic book and an American book. It's about the classic Stoic writings that the founders of America would have been familiar with. And we know they're familiar with them because they wrote about it. And at the peak of this is when we say the pursuit of happiness, to the founders, happiness meant virtue. And virtue meant a life of discipline and understanding Stoic wisdom. It really did. It doesn't mean the pursuit of sort of the accumulation of material wealth, which I think we tend to think that happiness resides in these transitory pleasures. They meant virtue. And we don't use the word virtue so much nowadays, do we? Because it sounds a bit stodgy. This was an important book. Rebecca Rishin, For the End of Time, which was a book about Messiaen's quartet. Olivia Lang had a new book this year, The Garden Against Time, which I read. I enjoy everything she writes. Her previous book was about solitude and about living in New York and about the engagement of the body and art. It was a very complicated, beautiful book. She wrote a book about Virginia Woolf, Along the River. That maybe was 10 years ago. I like her stuff. This one was a little bit not as simpatico for me this time, but just great writer. Now getting into August, One Lost Soul, which is a book about Nixon by Daniel Silliman, and really focuses on his Quaker beliefs, even throughout his entire life, how his Quaker upbringing both shaped him, constrained him, inhibited him. One lost soul. Did I say last soul? It's one lost soul. And so ultimately failed him as he ends as a raving drunkard in the White House. By Donald Kagan, I read a book about Thucydides. So not the histories, but about the histories and what can we tell about Thucydides from the history. This was a bit dull, but I read it. I read a book called Sonorous Desert by Kim Heinz Eitzen, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's a book about meditation and sound based on her experiences in the desert. His Final Battle, which is a book about the last year of Roosevelt's life. I kind of have a theme going on in August about sort of the last act of our presidents, Nixon and Roosevelt. I read Notebook by Tom Cox, who is an author I discovered on Substack. and has a wonderful set of. Well, his Substack is wonderful. I enjoyed. Sorry, I enjoyed Notebook a lot, and he's got 3 or 4 others that I intend to read through at some point. I don't know how I would describe it. Um, it's a. I want to say it's psychogeographic, but it's not really. Or it could be. What does that mean? Uh, it's a very introspective and yet wonderfully descriptive. It's a combination of internal perception and external description. I read a book called Psychomagic by Alejandro Jodorowsky. It was a weird book, but it's a book that I've returned back to because he kind of introduces a very magical way of looking at the tarot deck. So I've continued that survey after reading the book, trying to accommodate some of that in my own use of the tarot. I'm about 2/3 of the way through and 26 minutes in, so I hope you're all just kind of settling in with a cup of coffee or a beer or something. We're in September. I read Piano Rolls by James Parakilas, who was a professor of mine at Bates College. This is a series of essays about all kinds of things. The role of the piano in culture, the manufacturing of the piano, the selling of it, the music that came along as the piano became more ubiquitous, and then gradually the rise of like virtuoso. It's very interesting. I read The Work of Art by Adam Moss. Adam Moss is an editor at New York Magazine, I think, or New York Times, somewhere. But in this book, he has talked to maybe 20 different artists, writers and painters, sculptors, artists, right? And asked if he could see from the earliest sketches through to the finished piece, kind of could they talk him through all the different stages, and how do they get from a blank piece of paper to a finished work of art. I read it as you could read it as a chapter by chapter, open it up and read. I chose to read it through, but it certainly would have been a book to just have on the desk and open periodically. I read a book called Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory by Sven Berkitz, which is sort of a memoir that Sven wrote about Nabokov and about Speak Memory in general. I like books like that where there's a text, and this is a series. I read 2 of them, and I have 2 more, where a writer talks about a book and how it fits in their life. Oh, that's right. The next one was by Curtis Smith, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. This might have been what planted the seed for me to reread Vonnegut. Then I read a book called The Grid by Gretchen Baki. This is a book about the history of the development of electricity, I think mostly in America. But what it is to build an electric grid, and how did these things get funded, and who owns them, and what does it mean now that the technology has changed? Not just environmentally, but in terms of our usage, the idea of a huge power plant that can be kind of turned on and just churn out energy. We use energy differently. We use it more often and more spiky. It's an interesting book. In October, I read American Muse, which is a biography of William Schumann. At this point, I had started my graduate studies, and I was getting into composers like Schumann, Howard Hanson, really great American composers. All right, then I started Vonnegut. 1022, Play a Piano, Sirens of Titan, Cat's Cradle, Mother Night, God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, Slaughterhouse-Five, Breakfast of Champions, Slapstick, Jailbird, Dead-Eye Dick, Galapagos, Bluebird, Hocus Pocus, Timequake. And that was, I finished on Thanksgiving Day. Breakfast of Champions and Dead-Eye Dick together. I hadn't read them before. I hadn't read up to Slaughterhouse-Five before. But I hadn't read... Well, I'd read Slapstick. But I hadn't, from Jailbird on, I hadn't read any of those. And the evolution of his presence in the novels from kind of an introductory voice to then maybe a brief cameo, kind of a bit of a shy cameo, then increasingly more autobiographical, but autobiographical filtered through some quite preposterous initial point. Like Timequake, his last book, is incredibly autobiographical, but it begins with the premise that at a point in 2007, time quaked and we all went back exactly 10 years and then relived with no change those 10 years. This is preposterous. And then what happens when time picks back up again and you don't know that it's going to do that. Vonnegut is a humanist, we say, right? Is he a stoic? I mean, in the sense that what matters most in the books and I think in his life is the things that you do. It's not profound. It is profound. It's not complicated. Then in December, I finished Mahler by Jonathan Carter, which is just a nice overview of his life. I read most of Theodore Adorno's book, The Physiognomy of Mahler's Music, but that may be this was the toughest book of the year and the least rewarding. It's not worth it. Sorry, those of you who have an Adorno fixation. I don't think I'd certainly never read an entire book by him, and I couldn't do it again. I read a book called Grand Obsession by Perry Nyes. I picked that up in December when we were out in Philadelphia visiting my daughter. That and the Jonathan Carr Mahler book. Picked them up at a used bookstore near her apartment. Grand Obsession is about the author, Perry, who in her 40s decides to play the piano again. She had been a talented musician as a child, but then as a teenager really didn't keep up with it. And then in her 40s decides to play the piano again. Eventually decides to buy a piano that's much more expensive than she intended. Sounds magical in the showroom, and then when it gets to her house, it doesn't sound the same. So what is it that makes a piano sound the way it is? It's a mix of the voice, the all of the action. It comes down, I think, to her realizing that the tuning of the instrument combined with the action is what gives it that magic, and both of those are fleeting. The truly precise tuning lasts a day. The truly precise tempering of the felt of the hammers lasts a week, a month. And then you're left with an instrument that can still feed your soul. I talked about this in one of my other videos because I don't hear very well. I'm deaf and I have a hearing aid, but I feel very tactile. And it's one of the most important things in my life is to have a piano that responds. And I'm fortunate enough to have one now. This year, a year ago, we traded pianos, and I now have a beautiful refurbished Steinway. And yeah, this Steinway from 1924 does what I wanted to do. It has an intimate voice, um, sort of a grainy richness to it in the alto and tenor. Nice warm, but not super loud bass. But an absolutely gorgeous, gentle treble. That just it can sing like Emma Kirkby. It can sing like there's not a whole lot of vibrato in it. And then the last book that I read this year was And There Was Light, which is about Abraham Lincoln, written by John Meacham. And after finishing that book, I got another one by John Meacham. This mix of American history and religion is giving me a way to access some of the questions I have about faith and about America. This is something that's turning into a piece. If I ever finish the piano concerto, which is very, very close, it's just these last stages of making sure the score is correct are so time-consuming. It's no longer composition right now. It's just really trying to be meticulous, and I'm very, very bad at that. It takes me forever. But the piece is done. Now I want to write a piece like a cantata for a nice-sized choir and an ensemble with text primarily from Walt Whitman on Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. But I'm thinking I might make this a big piece, like a 2-hour piece, and throw in like the Gettysburg Address, stuff like that. I'm not sure yet, but this sense of sort of American transcendental, Emerson, Stoicism, visionary, kind of deeply religious, but in a way that I don't quite understand yet. The word that's in my mind right now as I try to understand it is providence, which resonates with my understanding of the idea of karma. But I don't want to say, I'm not looking for ways to say my Buddhism and Christianity are the same, because they're not. There's a physical experience of the spirit that is related. So anyway, so my reading for the start of 2025 is in that arena, and about this time next year we'll come back with another list. So this is a long video, and if you got this far, oh my goodness, thank you. I've enjoyed talking through all of this. If you have any questions, drop a comment. If you've read any of these books, or if you've read, let me know what your top 3 books were for the year. Oh, my top book for the year? In terms of, so I'm not thinking so much of the book that I enjoyed the most. I think if it was a question of which book did I enjoy the most, I probably would go back to that Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey, because I was so surprised by how much I enjoyed it. But in terms of books that have shaped me the most, I'm going to list 2. I'm going to list the Bernstein biography for the reasons I gave, right? It really, it supported me as I was making a decision about going back to school. It inspired me in the most immediate sense. And The Pursuit of Happiness, Jeffrey Rosen, The Pursuit of Happiness, because it opened up my eyes to a way of thinking about our politics and our modern culture in a way that's really informed by ethics and virtue. So